picture of all these freaks. Maybe it looks like my daughter Madeline, the one that's upside down, but I don't think it's her. I've never looked at it the other way.
Maybe it is her.
Are you guys ready? Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here to the June 13th, 2016 work session meeting of the New Albany Plain Local Board of Education. I'd like to call the meeting to order and request a roll call, please.
Mr. Newmoth?
Here.
Ms. Kalinowski? Here. Mr. Darrow?
Here.
Vice President McClellan is absent. President Kohler?
And I am here. So could we all please stand and join in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all very much. The pledge holds even deeper and more profound meaning this evening as we remember those who were unfortunately killed over the weekend in Orlando. So the first order of business is to approve the agenda. And my question for us all is, are there any additions to the agenda this evening?
There is an amendment to the agenda, and I will defer to Mr. Sawyer to share that with you.
Number 2, letter A, under the superintendent's consent items for action. Kimberly Kirtland should have an effective date of August 1st, 2016. The paragraph introduces the other 2 candidates as bus drivers with a proper effective date of August 17th. However, the third person on the list, Kimberly Kirtland, is being hired as the new guidance secretary at the high school, and her effective date should be August 1st because she's a 221-day employee. So we need to make it clear that her effective date is August 1st, 2016.
So noted. Are there any other corrections, additions this evening? Hearing none, could we please have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you very much. And could we have a roll call, please?
Ms. Kalinowski?
Yes.
Mr. Darrow?
Yes.
Mr. Newmoth?
Yes.
President Kohler?
Yes, that motion carries, and it takes us immediately into our discussion items for the evening. The first up is gifted programming, and I believe that Dr. Troyer is going to lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, President Kohler. Good evening. We are going to do a brief presentation on our gifted education program this evening and have time at the end for questions and any comments that you would like to make. I'm happy to have Mr. Joe Armpriester and Mrs. Valerie Bevelheimer joining me this evening with the presentation. So I'm going to begin by setting the stage with some contextual information for you related to requirements that the state of Ohio has for gifted education for school districts. And then Val and Joe will talk more about their role and what they have done as gifted intervention specialists in the district. You do have a copy of these handouts in your folders if you would like to follow along. So Ohio Revised Code does require that districts must identify gifted students, and it has a lot of procedures in how you do that, how frequently, in what areas, and I'm not going to go into detail in all of those this evening, but I do want to point out that the categories of giftedness in Ohio go perhaps broader than some people would realize if they aren't in education. So we need to screen and identify students who have superior cognitive ability. And this may be what people traditionally think of as gifted students. These are students who score at least 2 standard deviations above the mean on a test of intelligence or on a comprehensive academic assessment. In addition to that, we also are required to screen and identify students who have specific academic ability. And that is in the areas of reading and mathematics for all students, and then in the areas of science and social studies upon referral or request. So a student could not be at the level of 2 standard deviations above the mean on an IQ test, but could score in reading, for example, above the 95th percentile, and thus be identified as gifted in the specific academic ability area of reading. In addition, we are required to screen and identify students who have creative thinking ability and who have visual or performing arts ability. These two also are upon referral or upon request. We don't do whole grade screenings on these either. But you can see that there's a fairly broad definition of giftedness in Ohio. This varies from state to state, but in Ohio there are multiple categories. And as I indicated, we are required to screen and identify. However, districts are not required to then provide specialized gifted programming or services. However, the state does rate districts on how well they do with gifted education. So while there's not a requirement that we serve every identified student with a specialized program, they do have a gifted education district report card indicator. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. On our local report card, which I'm sure you've been accustomed to seeing over the past years, there is now a gifted education indicator. So it's kind of a holistic rating of how we do as a district in gifted education. And it has three components. The first is the Gifted Performance Index. And this looks at how well our gifted students who've been identified as gifted achieve in reading and math in the tests in grades 3 through 8 and the high school end of course exams. You have to have a gifted performance index of 115 as a district for you to meet this particular component of the indicator, and we are just under that at 113.27. So on our most recent report card, we did not meet the first component. The second one, gifted value added, that is where students who've been identified as gifted in grades 4 through 8, the state looks at the amount of growth. So in the course of a year, did they have the kind of growth that was anticipated? New Albany earned an A in this area and so met this component. The third component is gifted identification and services. And here there's a whole host of inputs that are looked at, from how often do we screen, how do we screen, what do we use, how do we serve identified students, just a whole host of areas. And so out of a total of 100 points, we had 87, which far exceeded the minimum threshold they were looking for, and so we met that. So in 2 out of the 3 areas of the gifted indicator, New Albany Plain Local School District did meet the criteria, but since we did not on the first one, then our overall rating was not met. So that is publicly reported annually, and we are still waiting on results from the most recent year. So what I've just spoken about is the prior year. Another piece of context that I want to give you is that in 2013, we asked Vanderbilt University to do an audit of our gifted program. This was just in an effort to continually improve what we do for students. It wasn't required by the state or anyone else, but it was something we voluntarily undertook to have an external view of what we were doing. So researchers from Vanderbilt came to our campus, they did interviews, they did surveys, observations, reviewed materials, looked at our programming, and they gave us a lot of recommendations. The whole study is on our website, so anyone can go to the New Albany website and see the entire Vanderbilt University study with the recommendations. They provided recommendations in 5 areas: identification of gifted students, curriculum and instruction, service delivery, which is how we provide services to identified gifted students, communications, and data. And there were a lot of recommendations in these areas, so I'm not going to go into all of those, but those are the areas that we looked at. We have been using those recommendations as a blueprint for improving our program. So we've been able to implement some of the recommendations, and we view this as a document that we'll continue to refer to as resources are available for us to implement them. Some examples of things that we have done that were in the recommendations are cluster grouping for gifted students in grades K through 5. So we've implemented that. Compacted classes in mathematics for students in upper elementary and middle school, and that is when you take multiple years of mathematics in 1 year. For example, you might do 5th and 6th grade math all in 1 year. So those are compacted classes. Also, opportunities for acceleration for taking advanced courses. For example, next year we have 52 middle school students who will be going to the high school to take a class. In addition to that, we have high school level courses being taught in the middle school. So we have done a lot in those years since the Vanderbilt study came out. We have not been certainly able to implement all of the recommendations, but we have done a number of them and have provided more services to more students in that way. In the next slide, you can see the number of students that have been identified in these various grade bands in these three main areas of giftedness. These are the areas that we're required to screen all students in: superior cognitive ability, reading, and mathematics. The other areas are upon referral, so that's why I've included just these numbers. We began doing the whole grade screening in second grade, so kindergarten and first grade numbers are not included. Those are upon referral only. But you can see the numbers here, and I just want to point out a couple of things as you look at these numbers. One is that students can be identified as gifted at any point in their career. So it could be as a kindergartner, it could be that they're not identified until fourth grade. It could be they're not identified as gifted in a specific area until sixth or seventh. But once they're identified, then they retain that gifted designation for the rest of their school career. So the number does continue to grow as you go through the grade levels. I'd also like to point out that the numbers here could be duplicates, and in some cases definitely are duplicates. So for example, in high school, we have 303 students identified as having superior cognitive ability. Well, some of those same students are also going to show up in the number of 367 under reading, or under mathematics, those 380 students, and there are probably some that show up in all three of those categories. So with high school, if you're trying to get like a total number of gifted students, you can't just add across because it's not an unduplicated count. For example, at high school, we have 637 students who've been identified as gifted. So you can see that close to 300 or so must have been identified in more than one area. As you look at the overall number of identified gifted students in the district and the overall number of students in the district, it comes out to about 39% being identified as gifted overall. You can see on this next slide how our staffing levels were impacted by the reduction in force. In 2014-15, we had 6 full-time equivalent staff working in the gifted program. This year, we had 2.5 gifted intervention specialists working in the program, and we already have in place an additional staff member for next year, taking us back up to 3.5 staff members in the gifted program. And so at this time, we're going to also talk about the service delivery model, and Valerie is going to come talk about the different ways that we serve gifted students, and then she'll be followed by Joe.
Good evening. As Marilyn said, in many of the things, it gives details of our service model, but I'd like to walk you through some of the steps and some of the other components. Our model consists of clustering gifted students based on their particular identifications. It could be superior cog students, it could be by reading, or it could be by math identification. Clustering also supports the second aspect of our model, which is providing differentiated instruction designed to meet student learning needs. Why is this crucial? Cluster grouping helps teachers design activities for multiple students with similar needs and enables gifted specialists to provide classroom support. Equally important, it provides a nurturing environment in which students who are gifted can flourish. We're fortunate to have access to the MAP data now in grades 2 through 8, and utilizing this data helps teachers design very targeted learning activities for students. It increases teachers' knowledge of student achievement levels and enables more individualized differentiation. Another component is acceleration, and Marilyn talked about some of the aspects of that. It was one of the Vanderbilt recommendations. We started about 10 years ago with approximately 20 students in the compacted math courses, and last year I believe there were more than 200 in grades 4 and 5 taking compacted math courses. This feeds up to the middle school, where almost a third of our students were in compacted 7, 8 math courses, and even some were in Honors Algebra 1. So as Marilyn said, we have had to add additional honors algebra 1 courses and honors geometry courses so that students don't have to walk to the high school for math courses. During this coming school year, students will have a new opportunity to experience compacted language arts classes in grades 7 and 8. They will have a compacted experience that's paired with a College Credit Plus composition course that will be delivered by Columbus State. So not only will their language arts be compacted, they'll end the year with the college credit. Creating and providing the written education plan is another big component of our service model. These documents, also known as WEPs, are required by the Ohio Department of Education for all students identified as gifted every year. The WEP provides detailed information about student identifications, their achievement levels, recommendations for differentiation strategies, acceleration if that's a part of the student's plan, and most importantly, student learning goals for the coming school year. WEPs are written to inform and assist teachers with instruction and provide information for our administrators as well as for the students and their families. With new math and reading identifications precipitated by the MAP assessments, WEPs are continually updated. A final component and a large piece of our gifted service model is providing professional development in terms of time to plan, collaborate with, and assist teachers with the design of strategies and curriculum materials that they need to differentiate for their particular groups of students. This often involves researching and designing learning opportunities that offer increased depth, complexity, advanced rubrics, self-directed or independent projects, or an accelerated pace with the content. In the 14-15 school year, gifted intervention specialists focused on direct service in the classroom with superior cognitive clusters. Classroom support took place in math classes, language arts classes, and at times science classes. In grades 4 through 8, there was also a focus on the social emotional learning activities for these students, including things like study skills, time management, developing a positive mindset, and resiliency. However, with the reduction in staff and out of necessity, our focus shifted this year, and Joe's going to explain more about that to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I was asked basically to come up and kind of walk you through the past, the present, and what our future is going to look like for Gifted Ed. There's 2 documents. There's the PowerPoint, and then also within your packet there is a gifted service model for 2015-16. This is a document that Val and I sat down with Mrs. Slanik, who is our .5 GIS that was added to our staff this year, to kind of give you a broader picture of what each of the job responsibilities were related to our gifted staff department. And so when you look at the 2014 and 15, before you can really dive into what our service model looked like, it's an important caveat to note that regardless of any year that you would look at, within our gifted service model, we've always cluster grouped. That was something that came from the Vanderbilt as an area of which was a strength within our district, and is something that we have continued with. One of the big differences, though, is we're now actually using an assessment tool that also guides our cluster grouping with data. So it's not just based upon identification for reading or for math, even though we've always grouped likability students. We're actually also now looking at RIT scores, because you can have a child who's identified in math that just barely met the criteria to be identified, and then someone else who's actually operating also gifted in math at 2 years out of grade level. And so we're also looking at that data to form our cluster grouping, so that even within the cluster groups, we're more closely aligned. But when you look at the 2014 and 15 model, one of the things that jumps out to you is the very first sentence, direct services. This is something that we were able to strive over the course of several years of slowly but surely adding staff, so that the GISs actually were going into the classrooms and co-teaching with the classroom teachers and working with those identified students. Years in the past, we were trying to wear way too many hats. And one of the things that came out from the Vanderbilt study is due to your staffing and due to the model that you're trying to implement, you're better served to focus your gifted intervention specialists on your most needy population, which were the cognitively gifted students. And so what we did is we basically released all of our reading and math students to the classroom teachers with support from the GIS, giving them the resources, guiding them through model lessons and things that we had done in the past. But all of the gifted intervention specialists' attention was on those cognitively gifted clustered rooms. And through that, we were able to more effectively and more frequently get ourselves into the classrooms to work with them. And we saw a lot of very positive benefits from that model. And it was something that not only helped the gifted students, but it also helped those classroom teachers, because it was more than just meeting with them and planning with them and maybe getting into their room once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, but you were in there multiple times each week. So you were able to better supervise the students, you were able to follow along with them, and more importantly, you got to know the students better, because learning styles is an incredibly important part of working with a child, whether they're gifted or not. And so that was an important piece that we had within that model. Not only did we do that, but we also worked with professional development, literally within every one of our schedules, whether you were working with 2-3 or whether you were in the middle school, you had design time to sit down with the teachers that you were collaborating with. It was part of their planning that they voluntarily sacrificed to us so that we could go in and that we had meaningful PD. So it was individualized for those staff members in the elementary. The middle school gifted intervention specialists attended all the department meetings. And so they literally would sit at the table with all the entire department staff and have those conversations, find out what are the resources that they needed to better enhance their instructional strategies or provide them a curriculum or to help them modify. This is something I would like to do. And therefore they then had an expert that could then go out and do some of the research for them and bring that back to the table when they met. And so that was another really incredible, important piece, and that continues. Another piece of it was the parent communication. When you were the gifted intervention specialist, although we had 2 part-time coordinators, 99.9% of the phone calls came to you because you were the one who were servicing the children. And so the parents wanted to talk to you, what can we do? What can we do at home to foster the continued enhancement of their learning and so forth. And then there was the social emotional piece. That was embedded within the whole class lessons, the creative problem solving, the inquiry method, as well as just, having them work together in smaller groups. And every year, I'm sure Val could attest to this, that you would have some student when you first pulled them all together and they would ask you, well, who are you and why am I sitting over here with you? And so I would go through my job is to make you think. And if I leave this classroom and you've not had to think today, I've not done my job. And then someone would yell, well, it's because we're all gifted. And so you would go into that whole social emotional piece of, well, what does it mean to be gifted? That it's not a definition of better, it's a definition of a strength in an area. And so that we would foster that. We used to have social emotional groups that met with the counselors as well in the past. Then as you fast forward into our present, due to the reduction in staffing, we actually started the school year with just the 2 coordinators. We did not have the 0.5 GIS. And basically, we assumed everything outside of the direct service. So as you can see, the direct service model is now omitted from that column. So we did not have direct contact with any of the gifted student population. What our roles was to go through and accommodate all of the WEPs and the WAPs and the cluster grouping. And our primary service was not only with the requirements under the Ohio Revised Code, but the professional development piece. And what we called this was an indirect service model, and what April liked to refer to it as was train the trainer. And so that we would go in and we'd meet with the classroom teachers, we would have those professional development opportunities. I offered several different ones throughout the year. Valerie did the same, whereas we brought the staff to us and that we would share resources with them, and particularly looking at the assessment data. How can you use this data to inform your instruction? Now that you know what you need to do, what can I do to help you get the resources to do it? And so we spent an awful lot of time doing that, but there was an overwhelming amount of assessment data coming at us. Because one of the big differences between 2014-15 and this school year is in 2014-15, we were only screening academic whole grade in grades 2, 3, and we were only screening cognitively gifted for grades 2, 4, and 6. This current year, we screened all students grades 2 through 8. And so we added 15 more sets of data that we had to go through. And under law, if you use an instrument that's on the approved screening, you therefore must use it to identify it. You can't just collect it and use it for instructional purposes. There's a requirement under law that if you do that, you therefore then have to use it as an identifier, which then triggers in adding to the WEPs and the identification letters and so on and so on. So Marcy Raymond, very shortly after we got into the school year and Val and I were drowning, said, you know what, we're going to bring in some extra help so that the 0.5 GIS not only was servicing the 4th and 5th grade, and particularly she was doing the Royal Shakespeare and Company's inquiry methods with grades 4, but she also primarily was assisting Val and I with all the record keeping and things to kind of get our heads back above water. Once we got through it all and we kind of got settled, and we were able to release her more so that she could spend more time with the students. And so that's kind of where she ended the year with, you know, somewhat assisting us, but she was primarily doing a lot of more things with the student body, going in and meeting with the classroom teachers, doing professional development, those kinds of things. Her responsibility was to 4th and 5th grade only. So then if you flash forward into next year, you'll notice, as Marilyn had pointed out, that we've added an additional full-time gifted intervention specialist. And so what we are proposing is that throughout that model, then Val and I can actually pull all of the administrative work off of those GIS's plates so that their sole responsibility is to work with students and work with staff, so that they do not have to go through the process of going through the data entry or creating WEPs or WAPs or any of those kinds of things. And so that their entire day consists more of directly working with kids. And under the guise of Kids First, it seems to make the most common sense that, you know, if we can release them of those sort of administrative type duties and allow them to focus all their attention on students, then that's a better use of their time. And so within that model, what we would like to do is, once again, focus all of our attention on grades 4, 5. Primarily, that's where the largest portion of our gifted population is. It's also where our 2 accelerated math courses begin. We have our 4-5 compacted math class and our 5-6 math compacted math class. Another thing that we've done to actually accelerate and provide more opportunity to students is we are actually going to be offering 7-8, which is a pre-algebra class, within the elementary building this coming year. So we have a certified teacher who is certified to teach all the way up through 8th grade math. And surprisingly, we have about 22, 23 kids that are ready for pre-algebra as a 5th grader. And the Vanderbilt study very clearly pointed that out. You need to create pathways for kids when they're ready. So it's a readiness factor. So through our assessment, through the use of the map data and all the other things that we have, we feel very confident that we're now able to appropriately place kids as well as offer them opportunities. And of course, since the ODE changed the guidelines behind an acceleration, they now fall under board policy. And under board policy 5410, it is an acceleration. And so each one of these students go through what we call the 6-week trial. And so it's not just you're automatically in this course. We are placing you in this course, and we're going to reevaluate over the course of 6 weeks to make sure it's a good fit. And then within the SLC structure, we're able to move kids back if it's not a good fit. But at the end of that 6-week trial period, though, once they get through that, they become officially accelerated, which will actually improve our performance index, because now they'll also be eligible to take the out of grade level state assessments. And so that you get bonus points for that, and there's all these kinds of things. So within your other packet, the gifted service model, it really does a breakdown to give you an overarching picture of what each role within the gifted service department is responsible for, what they were, what they currently are, and what we're proposing for next year. And having said all that, there's now also additional conversation because we have a new curriculum director for our K-5 program. And so we're bringing Mr. Emery in on it. And so we want him to have a voice too, to come in and look at what we're proposing, to analyze what we're doing, and to make potentially any additional recommendations for staffing or programming or those kinds of things. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Troyer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and Val. On our final slide, you can see that we refer again to the one additional gifted intervention specialist that we've already hired for next school year. At this time of the year, we are constantly monitoring all kinds of things related to staffing. So Michael Sawyers and I have been really watching enrollments, needs that pop up that we might not have anticipated, just trying to maintain and fit the puzzle pieces the best way we can. So we have had some conversations about whether there is a possibility or not to do anything more beyond the additional gifted intervention specialists that we've already committed to. And some of the scenarios that we have been talking about are the possibilities that are listed there. Could we hire a half-time gifted education secretary to help with all of these written acceleration plans with data entry and some of those kinds of things, and thus free up a little bit of the time of our gifted intervention specialists to provide more time for services to students? We talked about the possibility, if we, depending on what our needs are as we continue through the summer, of another half-time or full-time gifted teacher, and how they could focus potentially on grades 2 and 3, or 4 and 5, or both, or there might be other scenarios that come up yet too. So at this point, we are just kind of keeping an open mind, looking at what we have available to work with, and looking at what needs emerge as we continue to finalize staffing for next year. So we're still in a position of some flexibility and are just monitoring to see how things might turn out. So that concludes our presentation. And so at this point, I would turn it back over to you, Madam President, and we'd be glad to answer questions if you have any, or to have you discuss what we have shared.
Thank you very much. Let's start with questions from the board. Are there questions? It's a lot to absorb.
Yeah. Joe, you mentioned the model where there's like the teaching team and there's a gifted intervention specialist with the superior COG kids. How many years have we done that?
We've been servicing our cognitively gifted kids as well as our academic kids since I've been at this. And I think this was my 11th year within the department. And so basically what the Vanderbilt study shown was that we were wearing too many hats and trying to touch too many lives with our staffing model. And so they basically said, instead of less frequently working with the cognitively gifted kids, kind of release the academic only and focus all your attention on them. It's not that we ignored them, it's that we released our time with them and then used more of that train the trainer to give them the resources. And ironically, all of the staff that ended up with those clusters was very purposeful, because I had been in their rooms and we'd been teaching together for several years. So they were very comfortable with the curriculum that they were being asked to use. And then as we started getting more data, in particular over the last few years since we started using MAP in grades 2, 3, they actually had, reports that said that this child is ready for this, and that this child's ready to recognize fractions, this child's ready to convert them to decimals. And so they were able to actually really pinpoint their instruction for those students. So we've been using the direct service model for many, many years. What we did is we narrowed our focus on the most needy of our population.
And so we're not currently delivering that service anymore.
This current school year, we did not at all. We simply did not have the staffing to do that. And had we tried to do that, it would have been basically, maybe once every 6 weeks, I might come in for 40 minutes and try to work, because literally I was K-5. And there's a lot of kids.
So do any of these scenarios restore that model?
Yeah. automatically next year, because we're adding another FTE to our gifted department, that person, as well as Mrs. Slanik, who was the .5, we're releasing her entirely from the whole coordinator type duties, and they will be working directly with the 4th and 5th grade students. Obviously, staffing's a key component there. The more staff you have, the more opportunities there are for staff to go in and provide that intervention with students. But yes, we are definitely going to have GISs in the room. Then that also will enable Val and I to also kind of go in for the academics and continue with that train the trainer model, meeting with them, providing resources, as well as working with our gifted intervention specialists. Making sure that, that they're not becoming too overwhelmed, to kind of intercede and help as we can.
Not to take over, I just wanted one more question. So what is your hope if you could have your wish in terms of the model and adding back anybody, what would you like to see that person?
That's a dangerous question. If at minimum, I think that we need to restore our staff back to where it was. I don't know to the degree. I think Val would need to speak to the middle school. One person servicing all of 6-8 is quite a task. I think, though, if we had one additional person for next school year that was focused in the 2-5, what we could do is then have one person that's solely focused on 5th grade, one person that's solely focused on 4th grade, and use the .5 to work with grades 2-3, because the numbers are much smaller.
And that would be close to back to what we had last year.
Right. It would.
We each had one grade and one cognitive kids to work with.
And again, what they actually did, it was still up for discussion. I mean, that's where we need Mr. Emery to come in and look at what our current model was, or and what he would like to see it become. You may have an intervention specialist that specializes in math, and so it would make more sense for them to work with both 4th and 5th grade, and the other person's passion's more language arts, and so they work 4th, 5th instead of just 4th and just 5th. So there's a lot of options, but that would increase the frequency of them going into the classrooms and working with students, because honestly, cognitively gifted is not necessarily always a gift. That they are also at-risk students, and they need support services.
So your goal is to have both the direct service and the train the trainer model?
Yes. And that's really what the role of the coordinator should be, is that they take care of all the administrative things, all the Ohio Revised Code reporting, all the WEPs, updating, cluster grouping, working with admin, and then facilitating to the GISs so that the GISs can do their jobs.
And just to play devil's advocate, what's the downside to just the train the trainer model?
Well, just like with any intervention, that the more intense focus and the more expertise that can work with a child, the more likely they are to be successful. And pretty much all of the data supports that.
Meg, can I interject?
Sure.
Just to add additional.
Let me still hear.
Stay there for a second. Just to add additional context for that and some data, I think would help everyone understand. Even when we were moving to expand and enhance gifted services back in 14, 15, we still were not anywhere near the state recommended ratio of 1 to 60 students. And I think just for the gravity of context, if you could share with everyone, I hate to put you on the spot, but I know you know these numbers, what your ratio was and what your ratio is today.
Ratios were just cognitive or total population?
Total population.
Our ratios have always been somewhere around 300 to 1. You know, when you look at, well, at least for me, it was 300 to 1 once the first round of whole grade screening happened in 2nd grade. 4th and 5th grade was closer to what, 120 to 1, 130 to 1? Something like that.
And what about just cognitive?
If it was just cognitive, we're identifying roughly about 15% of the population, so it was closer in line to what the Ohio requirement is if you're going to report them as being served. So
And I can tell you, middle school, my numbers for next year are 543 to 1. That's the beginning of the year. That's without
But if I understand correctly, under the current model and the model for next year that's been proposed, most of the subject area gifted are being served with in their existing classrooms, either via acceleration or with the train the trainer model.
that is
Exactly,
correct.
or train the
And-
teacher model. So,
Right.
so the direct service model really is for the
Superior
superior
cog.
cog, and there the ratio is, as Joe said, is at the state recommendation.
Absolutely.
There's our numbers for cognitive, current numbers, prior to screening second grade.
So to clarify, the superior cog is where you're proposing the direct classroom intervention
That is correct.
only.
Which is the recommendation from the Vanderbilt study to
Okay.
basically pare back as a school district, let specific academic be served within their specific grade level through, back to Mrs. Kalinowski's point, the train the trainer model through professional development with teachers to provide direct supports to kids and then focus the additional supports as necessary for the gifted population by servicing directly the students that are identified as superior cognitive.
Okay, thank you. Now, an additional question relative to those that are identified in subject matter via math or reading. Is the primary measure there the MAP scores?
It is. The MAP is an approved instrument, and since we use that for our screening, not only for the gifted screening, but it's also for our academic growth. That's another beauty of the MAP. We were able to embed the MAP scores because they have projected growth goals to find out whether or not we're differentiating well enough and we're modifying curriculum well enough for students to grow regardless of where they are. The MAP score actually gives you two different reference points. It gives you a nationally grade level norm, and then it also gives you an individualized RIT score. The individual RIT score is not based upon grade band, it's based upon their individual academic content knowledge. And so then you can actually look across grade levels to find out where they are, and then it projects between, we know when our first testing date is, we know when the spring is, and it'll make a projection. If you present to them enough content that is content they don't already know, they should grow this number of points by that next testing point. So we also embedded that within their WEPs so that we have a target. That also is a target that the parents can kind of keep track of because we test again in the winter to see are they moving towards the target. And if not, then we know, okay, we need to seriously intervene. We need to come in with some heavy intensive changes in what we're doing because they're not growing.
But to some degree, those are a content-based measure, correct? If they've had exposure to that academic content, they're likely to do better on the MAP score?
That is correct.
Do
That is
most of
correct.
our kids hit their targets? or
Yes.
Is it unusual for a child not to?
It's not unusual by any means. It's also a reason why it's an approved instrument for teacher evaluation within growth targets. You typically, if you have 90% of your students meet their growth target, then you're rated a 5 and those kinds of things. So what is considered average is 70% was what you could typically expect.
So are those, is that kind of lack of performance, can that be remedied through professional development? Is that what happens in that instance?
Well, that's the goal.
Yeah,
Absolutely. The goal is to use the data to inform your instruction. And so if the data is suggesting that they're not growing at the rate that they should be, well, then we need to change something. And that means instructional strategies, it means curriculum modifications, it means intervention support, it means calling parents and, hey, we need your help at home too. Here are some things you can do at home to help support what we're doing here at school.
okay. And that would be part of your function as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. I spent a lot of time sitting down with individual teachers once the results came in, analyzing the results, helping them group students within their math instructions. They do a lot of what they call daily 5 instruction so that it's individualized per content area, per level within that content area. And so it's to help them analyze and figure out, okay, even though you're teaching addition and subtraction with regrouping as a grade level band for the students that I'm servicing and that they're servicing. They've known that since they were probably in, first grade. And so just to regurgitate and show them that again is not going to help them meet target. So we need to figure out, okay, what do they know? Use a lot of pre-assessments to figure out, okay, this is what they know, and this is what they're ready to learn, and then bring that to them. The whole idea is to bring the curriculum to them instead of sending them to the curriculum. Although we've done that through our compacted math courses and accelerating them as well.
Do we have data from this past school year yet on the progress of the kids who are identified as gifted?
From the state reporting or from our own MAT data?
Whatever data you.
We definitely have MAT data.
Okay.
That was turned in, May 10th? As far as the teacher growth pieces, because that is their evaluated growth is based upon the MAT data for grades 2 through 8 in reading and math. And there's SLOs, and that's a whole nother presentation, Mr. Darrell. But
I think important to that point, when you go back to the last slide that was on the screen, and it's the one that Dr. Troyer spoke about, the actual recommendations for next year. It's really the second paragraph. Possible additional staffing scenarios are determined pending overall enrollment changes and data availability. So right now we do have MAP data based upon the spring assessment that was provided, but the state assessment data doesn't come back. The first release of that is scheduled for June 30th. The emails have already started coming from the state, as Dr. Dominique has shared to date, that report cards right now are expected for public release in September. So we'll get our first look at the data at the end of June. The second wave is the middle of July with public release in September. So until we get access to the next layer of data, it really goes back to the continuous improvement mindset that Dr. Troyer, Mr. Armpriester, and Mrs. Bevelheimer have talked about related to the presentation, that there are improvements in place for next year. We then have to determine what else is necessary to maximize the resources we currently have to better meet the needs of kids, or do we stop doing something to start doing something? And that's the example on this slide related to the gifted secretary, because of late we've been having conversation about some of the data entry, the clerical type things that are required in the WAP and the WEP, and what that does to remove instructional time, the written accelerated plan and the written education plan. Both exist. One's a WAP, one's a WEP. That's what the state calls them, ultimately, but that's their world. So is there a different way to do some of that work that would then free up something that they're currently doing to spend time with kids? And that's a conversation that's ongoing. That's why when Dr. Troyer talked about the possibility, and it's really no different than the conversation we had at the last board meeting, when justified to meet the developmental outcomes of kids, both instructionally and academically, we look at providing different solutions in place. And it's been the same conversation related to the entire staffing process that we've gone through the confirmation process to do. This is the start of a conversation yet to be determined what the outcome is until we have more data, continue conversations, both Mr. Armpriester and Mrs. Bevelheimer, and quite honestly, Mr. Emery coming on as the Director of Elementary Ed, Dr. Hamilton coming on as Director of Secondary Ed, and 2 more principals that hopefully you're going to approve the hiring of tonight, to basically then become, again, part of this conversation from all the different angles we've looked at, including the parent feedback that we received. And of late, Dr. Troyer and I just met with Mrs. Triplett from the Navigator representation to talk about the parent perspective related to gifted education within the school district. So it really is a continuous improvement cycle. We're trying to take the recommendations of the Vanderbilt study, focus and expand upon specific service levels that are necessary to meet the needs of kids, do some things differently, but yet realize that there still could be another opportunity when all the data is available to determine what else we can still do for 16-17. And they gave great examples tonight, and including in the conversation we had with Mrs. Triplett, the clustering grouping within the school district itself has been effective. Vanderbilt basically said it's one of the strongest things that does exist within the school district. You should continue that. And that's still in place for next year. The compacting opportunities, There is a recommendation to continue to expand that. There is ELA coming in the fall for the first time in grades 7 and 8 as quite a quote unquote a pilot for additional compacting at the middle school level to determine what specifically that does. It has a twist because it's also got College Credit Plus assigned to it that they spoke about this evening, which is different, but we're trying it to see what does that mean for kids. The accelerated opportunities that Mr. Darrow's publicly spoken about previously at meetings related to gifted education continue within the school district. Dr. Troyer mentioned tonight there's 52 eighth graders going to the high school that need a specific class that doesn't warrant a high school offering at the middle school, but there's hundreds of other kids taking physical science at the middle school for high school credit, which is accelerated science, which is what they need and it's what they should be taking. So I think generally when you go back and look at the broad spectrum, there is always opportunity to improve. We believe by doing what we've currently done for next year, there's improvements already in place, and we remain committed, and that was the word that I used with Mrs. Triplett when we spoke, to continue to assess what else is it that we need to do to better meet the needs of the kids. It's the balance of the opportunities with the resources and the supports necessary to meet the needs of the kids, which is really what I believe Mr. Armpriester, Mrs. Bevelheimer, and Dr. Troyer have done a wonderful job this evening speaking about.
I have a couple of questions. One of the things that struck me that is different from the support levels that we had in the past is really making a conscious effort to deal with the socioeconomic, but no, that's not what I mean. Social emotional needs of these kids. And I wondered what sorts of conversations you all have been having about that, because it seems to me that that would be a high priority need as well.
You might have gave me a chance to sit down. Valerie, when we were meeting, so Val, if you want to come up for.
I can't speak necessarily to what the elementary is planning, but I've already spoken to guidance counselors at the middle school because it's a huge need for those students.
Yeah.
And teachers aren't always equipped to deal with it, especially in multiples at times. One teacher told me that she never had so many seventh graders crying in her class, and she didn't understand why. And it's just a piece of those students. They need help in learning how to deal with it. So I think it's important. As fifth grade specialists, it was something that I focused strongly on. And I think our fourth grade specialists did too. At the younger years, it's a little different. It's more, excuse me, working with groups of kids in the problem-solving mode and kind of helping them understand how to deal with their particular level or area of giftedness.
Yeah, and it's the asynchronous development. I mean, that you can have a really high-level conversation with them that's so beyond their age, and then they're totally devastated because their shoelace broke. You gotta help staff understand that that's just part of their profile. The other piece is that when we were actually bargaining with April over staffing for this year, it was proposed, April was really concerned with if we're adding a staff member to the elementary, then we need to be reciprocal and do that to the middle school. And Valerie actually advocated for a mental health specialist instead as a result of that. And the board with Michael Sawyer through his study and whatnot made that recommendation, and you've made that hire. So we're also addressing staff on that end of it as well.
Great, good. Talk to me a little bit about our K-1 critters. And, I know that the wholesale identification doesn't happen until second grade, but we certainly do have some very bright and frustrated kindergartners and first graders.
Right, they're all there. There's no doubt about it. We've just not cast the net yet. And that's really what I kind of consider it. Val and I are the fishermen of the district, and we just keep casting the net and try to catch every little fish we can. Primarily what we focused on is through nominational referring. Not only do we get the parents who believe that their child is, outside of typical norm, and encourage them to request. We've actually tried to streamline that process, putting it on the district website so that there aren't forms that have to go back and forth. They can go on and in a matter of just a few moments, submit a referral and go through that screening. We still cluster group them once we identify them. And then all of us as an entire department really go in and do professional development with that staff as requested. I every year go over and meet with the staff and encourage them to understand characteristics of giftedness, to help guide them with their nominational processes and so forth. Because there's also a fine line with that too. If the teacher makes a nomination of a child that they believe may be cognitively gifted, and then we go through that screening and then they don't qualify, that there's a consequence related to that too, is that, that you have those kinds of conversations with the parent community as well. And so that, we try to guide them to help them, but by state law, that they can refer anyone. Any parent can refer twice a year. And so we have that embedded, but we do not have an actual member. Prior in 2014-15, Mr. Lester, who was the .5 gifted coordinator, prior to being reduced after the levy failure, he kind of took over K1 for us, and that he was there and helping with staff. We've committed quite a bit of our resources and placed them within their professional learning libraries, center activities and things. And again, it's a kind of an as-needed call, that we're totally always available to them if they need help. And I've been over there several times this past year, meeting with teachers who had a child that they said, I just need some additional support. What can I do?
And I still get emails from kindergarten and first grade teachers asking for strategies or materials. It's how I got here. I was a kindergarten teacher for 19 years, and I saw those kids, and I thought, what are we going to do with them? And the gifted department at the time gave me the rhetoric, only 3 to 5% of our population is identified. And I knew that wasn't true. So I did go to school so that I could help my students, and then ended up leaving the classroom, which has also been a wonderful thing.
Well, that is such a nice segue into my next question, which is that if we are dealing with a population where almost 40% of our kids are identified, what are we doing to encourage staff to continue their education, to get this kind of extra training or certification?
Well, there's not only Val and I constantly in their ear, encouraging them. Marcy had went through and tried to and shared with staff several different programs that were fairly accessible, not too costly. If they were interested within that, Val and I do our own professional development with staff to help encourage them to understand what is a differentiated process. Here are some resources available to you. Actually, Mrs. Smith, basically grabbed me by the arm and said, oh, by the way, I scheduled a professional development meeting in your office. All of the second and third grade teachers are coming and so forth. So, we have some of those things. I know that Nanette had started looking at possibly finding a revenue source through the parent community or professional organizations to potentially be able to help support financially teachers that might be interested. I don't know where that's at right now, but there's definitely opportunities available to them. It's just a matter of them having the same passion that Val and I have.
I think the math data is lighting a fire under some of them.
That's
They're
good.
seeing what these kids are capable of. In the middle school, I think there's maybe 3 teachers right now working on their licensure, and we have 3 that do have licensure. So clustering students in their classrooms is direct service.
Right.
I think more people are coming on board with it.
That's great.
That's really good to hear. That's wonderful.
If I could just ask about the accelerated classes, it sounds like that was also the result of the Vanderbilt study, that's been increasing over the past couple of years.
It was happening before that, but Vanderbilt really recommended that we make more offerings, grades 5 through 8, I think, but we've included 4 through 8, and clearly it's necessary for our students. They come knowing quite a lot.
Right. The initial pilot was 5-6 only, and then we realized we needed for them to go somewhere. And so then we created 7-8, and this was what, 8 years ago,
More
something?
than that, I
Yeah.
think 10 or 12.
And then once those got embedded and in place, then I started kind of basically campaigning to create the 4-5. And I have other campaigns going on right now to offer more and more opportunities at a younger age. The difference before, it was always based upon a teacher nomination. You know, I think this child, is a really strong math student. Well, unless you have data to actually show that they know the content that you're asking them to skip, then it's just an opinion. We now have data. And so we're able to use the data and look across out of grade level norm tables to make solid recommendations. Honestly, we've been dealing a lot of pushback from some of our own staff and colleagues. It's like, well, I'm really worried about this, third grader that's going to be taking 5-6 math. It's like, don't. Everything that I've seen suggests that they are ready. So let's give them an opportunity. And if they're not, then we have built in the trial process to place them back in a more appropriate setting. And so I think once we get through it, last year or this past school year was the first year that we had 4-5 math, and we had map data to guide those placements. They were outstandingly successful. Matter of fact, some of them were so successful that they're skipping 5-6 and they're taking 7-8 next school year.
Is there any limitation in terms of the expansion of that program? I probably would never have been on this board, but I might have qualified as relatively smart and hardworking. Is there anywhere in that 45 to 59 percentile, or do you have parent nominations perhaps for those?
There are students that are not identified as gifted participating in those programs. It's not a limitation.
Right. The problem is to expand it outside of board policy 5410 means you need to change your board policy, because the board policy clearly indicates that they need to be able to show mastery of the content they're skipping.
Right.
And if the assessment that we're using is indicating that they do not, then we can't, in good conscience, place them in that course.
I understand. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned earlier the MAP testing is the primary measure, and that's content-based. I'm just wondering if you don't get identified as a second grader, if perhaps then you're not exposed to that content by virtue of not being accelerated, that sort of becomes a cycle that maybe is.
I mean, if they're truly differentiating curriculum based upon demonstrated need, then the ID is not a requirement to be exposed to appropriate content. You do not have to be identified as gifted to qualify for any of our advanced placement classes. You need to meet the criteria established through the administrative with Val and I's input. We work really hard to try to come up with and talk to a lot of experts to look at what would be a number by which we felt very comfortable. And it was the 80th percentile of the course that you're entering into. And so to place into the 4-5 class, you needed to place in the 80th percentile of fall 5th graders, those students that had already completed the 4th grade content. And we felt if you were there, then you were very much ready for that content.
Another big assist for the other students that are not in accelerated classes will be access to ALEX, the online math enrichment program that I think all kids 2 through 8 will have next year. That's an amazing
Oh, it's been
tool
great.
for them.
I agree.
Yeah, you're
Absolutely.
very familiar with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not trying to restrict access. We're trying to cast the net as wide as we can, but you have to be careful with those type of accelerated programming options, that you don't want to place a child that has a very strong positive math self-image and place them in a course of which they cannot be successful. And then they're judging themselves against the other peers that are content ready. And it just impacts all the other social emotional things that, President Kohler had referred to.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to be very careful, but we do also, according to board policy, have an appeal process by which the parents can then appeal our decision to place them in a typical course placement. And then that goes to admin. And then they talk to the classroom teachers, they look at all their data, and ultimately they make the decision.
We do have students doing work over the summer so that they can retry to participate in some of the accelerated coursework.
And every fall, they can request an acceleration. So if they didn't meet the criteria in the spring, they can request it and we'll reanalyze it in the fall and they can be moved. So
That's really helpful. Thanks for the explanation. I wasn't aware of that 6-week trial period either, so it's good to have that in safeguard in place.
and that's in their WAPs. So it's one of the pieces that's within that there is a 6-week transitional period to ensure they're being successful.
And it's also for them, if they decide, or their parents to decide that this is too much, more than I bargained for, they can move back with no penalty.
Right now, we're clustering in grades 3 to 8
We
or,
cluster every grade that has an identified child in it.
We're trying middle school to do it the best that we can. Math courses are all over the place, so that causes a little bit of disarray. Right now, what I asked for was clustering in language arts, especially, and of course, superior cognitive students. And then hopefully the math will kind of shake out where it needs to be.
Let me restate that, not in the high school, because their course selection
Right.
takes them where they want to go.
and you refine the clusters every year,
Yeah.
so they can go in and out of their clusters.
Absolutely. One of the misconceptions was that SLCs were prison walls, and they weren't. They were forts. They were forts for a year, so that we put them within an SLC, but if their cluster grouping changes or their math options changes, and if there's not those options within their current SLC, then we're going to move them to a more appropriate place. And so we tried to maintain SLCs because there is the point behind an SLC to develop that, community. But they're not prison walls that we, move them. And I also want the students to also have opportunities to work with other like-minded kids. I don't know that anyone would per se want to be in the same homeroom with the same group of kids, all the way through their educational career.
And with the superior cognitive cluster, is that strictly superior cognitive or is it a mix of kids?
No, our cluster, that's a great question. I don't think we ever actually addressed that. Our cluster model is we try to stay somewhere between 8 to 12. And so no more than 50% of the class typically is clustered. We can't have clusters as low as 5 or 6, depending on the breakdown. Now, the compacted math classes are what we call super clusters because every child qualified to get into the course, and the vast majority of them are gifted.
So then with superior cognitive, is it the rest of the population in that class?
Well, what we try to do is to stay within one deviation.
Okay.
So that there's not a huge stretch in ability within cognitive clustered rooms or any of our class composites, really.
So that makes it easier for the teacher.
Absolutely. Because you have to remember, our primary service model is cluster grouping with differentiation.
Right.
Figure out what do they know and then provide them access to that content to help them learn.
Approximately what is one standard deviation on the IQ scale?
It's 15 points. Means 100, so 115 and to 130 is the next deviation. 130 and above is cognitively gifted, plus or minus 3 or 4 points depending on standard error.
Well,
I play with these numbers a lot.
I'd like to thank all three of you really for a very clear and valuable presentation tonight. I think that the takeaway for me is that even with our reduced resources, we are still managing to, for the most part, offer our kids a very rich experience and one that is highly individualized and one that is very compassionate and also cognizant of, what did you call it, Joe?
Asynchronous development.
That's it.
Yes.
That's it. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so
Thank you,
much.
guys.
Thank you.
And that brings us to our next discussion item, which will probably be quicker. Because Dr. Sawyers does talk rather rapidly, so, or Mr. Sawyers, sorry. I just put you in the super cog category there, so.
I am gifted. I did have a web. We want to continue this evening with an update on the superintendent's entry plan. If you recall, ultimately, the charge given to me by the Board of Education for the superintendent was to create the culture of accountability that achieves the best academic and developmental outcomes for each student. That's being interwoven into 5 pillars of my plan throughout the school district that I've talked about at every board meeting since selection on April 12th. Governance, organizational capacity alignment, student achievement, which is our primary purpose, engagement and communications, and operations and finance. So after the last board meeting, we finished phase 1, which was immediate, the first 30 days of workday action after hire. We're now into phase 2. It's called pre-entry in my plan, and I've tried to give you the bullets for basically what's happened in the last 10 work days. So we've tried to continue to achieve many things within the plan itself, some of them crossing over multiples. But transition calendar planning continues with Dr. Dominique. Board member discussions are ongoing. Staffing discussions for 16-17 continue. You see that evidence tonight based upon the hires that are being recommended as we continue to move forward in the plan. I've had multiple stakeholder meetings in the last 10 days here at work. We've met with the McCoy board. I've met with the city of New Albany. I've met with the New Albany Community Foundation, New Albany Rotary, CAPA, and the McCoy Owners Group. We're working on revisions to the joint owner agreement specifically for the McCoy relationship. And you'll be getting some additional information from me in the next 2 weeks related specifically to that. We continue to work on budget submissions. Everything's basically being put into the system. The new fiscal year starts July 1st. So we've been fine tuning those budget recommendations that were submitted in the spring that we've previously looked at, but to make sure that they're available for building usage and department usage beginning July 1st of the new fiscal year. Gifted programming has been front and center in the last 10 days. We've had multiple meetings to talk and try to educate me on the gifted program that's existed within the school district. We had a wonderful meeting with Mrs. Triplett for the Navigator Group to understand parent perspective, to start the conversation about ultimately what's happening in the gifted world from a parent perspective. Mr. Voss has been very busy after last month when we executed the contract related to the wireless bandwidth. So we're now in execution mode for the K-1 in the high school. So that work is part of the summer operations piece that we've met on. We've spent several conversations related to summer work orders and projects specifically with Mr. Strigley to try to make sure the district continues to move forward. There's an inordinate amount of summer project work that actually does happen to make this place function for the 186 days the teachers and kids are here throughout the school year. So it actually has a huge impact to have this little downtime. We added the wrinkle this year, 2-5 special. Mrs. Smith thanks me every single day because she has still the pleasure of 150 campers that are here for the Eagle Summer Day Camp. So the 2-5 will be basically inundated at the end of camp. So the 2-5 building will be the last one. Don't panic, Mrs. Smith. It is on the radar, truly it is. That will get done by the entire custodial maintenance department in 5 days at the end of camp. So it's going to be magic. We've spent a lot of time, 5 rounds interviewing the K-1 and the 2-8 elementary principals in the entire selection process. Our 2 finalists for recommendation this evening for hire are here, and I'll talk about them in just a couple minutes. But we spent a lot of time going through the interview process to make sure we found 2 extraordinary candidates, and we're very excited to publicly introduce them this evening. I've been working with the AO staff. We are reorganizing, planning, and boxing and moving people. So there's a lot of things moving around at the administrative office in preparation for changes that are coming. We have met with PLE and OPSI leadership for ongoing. We introduced a conversation with Hanover Research really almost 10 days ago. Dr. Troyer and I had a conversation with Mr. Voss. We're doing a data study within the school district as part of a data mining activity to try to identify specific areas for outcomes for improvement directly related to student achievement. and I'll have more to share with the board on that in the future. The Communications Department, Patrick Bastille and I have been having conversations about 1617. It's scary, but the back to school stuff does happen in the summer. The back to school website's being populated, the back to school parent communications, the postcards, the bus route assignments, all that magic stuff that happens in preparation for the first day of school in August. We've had conversations about the quality profile, district surveying. We had put in the 100-day plan that there will be a summer survey on communications, so we're in the process of finalizing that, and I'll share that with the board before public release for your final input. Website development and social media conversations. Mrs. Kalinowski met with me last week with Mr. Galloway and a few others to talk about the PTO and the new role for the PTO liaison that's coming to the school district. So we had a planning meeting for the PTO for 2016-17. This morning, we finalized the plans for 16-17 for the Jefferson series with the New Albany Community Foundation. There's 3 outstanding student lecture series that'll be coming to the school district during the 2016-17 school year, and we worked on the final arrangements for that this morning. And we've also met with the New Albany Police Chief and the City of New Albany. I'm trying to get a creative solution related to transportation. The city is decommissioning 2 police vehicles, and we are in search of one for safety reasons for a student that gets transported to an educational opportunity outside of our school district that has specific transportation requirements. So I'm in the process of trying to negotiate with the city to secure a vehicle that they are getting rid of. And I'm hoping that the city council, perhaps this evening at the meeting that's currently going on, would find it in their hearts to say that they should give it to the school district. So the city and I have been having that conversation. In addition to that, the police chief and I have been having conversations related to safety and security. We're updating the security plans for the school district for resubmission to the Attorney General's office and having conversations about other opportunities, including the introduction of search dogs on the school campus, specifically for paraphernalia or drug material next year, and talking about the possibilities of what that can look like. So as we work through and navigate those conversations, I'll have more information to share. But the police chiefs asked us to consider introducing that into the school community to help our community at large, given the ongoing issues that are apparent in other communities themselves. So
That would involve a change in board policy, would it?
potentially yes, potentially no. It depends on interpretation.
I see.
So I'm just now starting that process now that the police chief and I have resurrected this topic. Dr. Domini and I tried to introduce this previously in conversation, and there is an interest base within the police department. So I believe that this may move forward, and there's a lot of proactive communication we'll have to do with families to do this. I did implement the program when I was superintendent in Perry. And there's a lot of things that have to be introduced to help people understand how it works. Because the first time it happens and 13 different communities send canine units to your campus, people panic because they see 13 cruisers roll in and everybody thinks something's happened. So it's typically unannounced. So the first one, you typically educate first, and then thereafter you go to the unannounced opportunity. But we have to make sure the parents and the community understand what would be happening before we introduce that to the school community and how it keeps kids safe. So it's been a busy 10 days. We have achieved several things within the 100-day plan. We're rolling, so we're getting a lot done. People are seeing that. So it's been very nice, though, to be honest with you. I've had several parents that I've seen in the last week and a half because of the 5 different interview committees that we've had. That have told me they're watching the board meetings, they're tracking our progress, specifically mine. They want to know if there's going to be a scorecard, so I have to think about that because they're asking, you know, how do I get to show that I met that specific area? And I said, well, I do report at every board meeting, so I am kind of doing the public scorecard. But if you need a visual, that was an interesting concept, so I'm thinking about it. I'll have a solution. I just have to think about it.
Don't worry.
I kind of said that to the parent too. I said, if you have any questions, just call Mr. Darrow. He'll tell you. I said, he's keeping track of every box I achieve, so it's all good.
So what did you do with the other 2 hours that were available in the
My
last
other
10
job that I
days?
still have in the school district. So I'm still working on that too. So Mrs. Jenkins and I have had wonderful conversations about the opportunities that we're sharing within the operations department. So she's very excited. She just came back from vacation, so she had her week of reprieve.
Not really. I love to emails.
Yeah, well, I left those in your inbox for you to find. So. Are there any questions that I can answer? I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, that's great. Now is the point in our agenda where we entertain public participation. Thank you very much. And we have one speaker this evening, Carrie Millard. Carrie, would you give us your name, obviously, and your address?
Yes, so Carrie Millard, 5450 Snyder Loop in New Albany. Thank you,
Thank
President Kohler. Hi, Dr. Gumley, Mr. Sawyers, and the board. I just wanted to take a moment tonight because I know we were talking about gifted education to express my support for this team who has made a huge difference in my family's life, Mr. Armpriester and Mrs. Bevelheimer. Both of my children are identified as superior cognitive. One is in middle school, one is in the 2-5. My son will be in 7th grade, my daughter will be in 4th grade. We came to this school district because of the gifted program. We were in a different school district and moved to New Albany because of the gifted program. And we were crushed by the levy loss, as everyone in this district was, and the loss of gifted intervention specialists has made an impact. My daughter, my son is in the accelerated program in the middle school. Your question, sir, about the content part being taken care of by those content teachers. So my son was getting the content of science and math and all of those acceleration, but struggled in his first year of middle school. The transition to middle school is hard, and there's that whole social emotional part that the classroom teachers, especially in middle school when they're dealing with hundreds of students, don't necessarily get to address. There's something really tremendous when you have dedicated GIS with a classroom teacher, with the trainer, with the differentiated instruction, but to just think that a classroom teacher who has 30, and our class size has increased this year. So with a tremendous number of kids, some on the other end of the spectrum, everyone in the middle, all of the new curriculum, the core, the testing, all that is placed on a classroom teacher, to think that that teacher can also do differentiated and meet all the needs of nearly 40% of the classroom, I think is just too much. I've been involved with the Gifted Parent Advisory and with Nanette and the Navigator program. When we had 6 in Gifted, that wasn't enough. And so I'm thrilled to hear that there's one more for next year, but I just wanted to be one parent to come to you to say, there is something that happens when you have dedicated GIS who understand not only the academic content, but how the brains work of a child who is a superior cognitive kid. They need, I don't know if I'm articulating it correctly, but there's just a lot going on in that brain. It's going all the time. There's issues of perfectionism. There's issues of self-doubt. There's so many things that are going on, and they're thinking all the time. A dear friend of mine who encouraged us to get our son tested, he was one of the ones who was identified very early on. He was identified at 4 years old. So he started kindergarten at 4. So he's 11 in middle school. He turned 11 in middle school. But her phrase was, you have to feed the machine because it's always on. So I just want to be one more parent to say to you, the greatest return on investment that you can make is additional GIS. The very first part of the mission statement of our school district is to ensure high achieving, ethical, intellectually curious, but there's no greater way to improve performance, get more kids at high achieving than to have more talented people like these individuals sitting over here who spend their entire day, morning, noon, and night, all year, thinking about feeding that machine. What makes a superior cog? What makes a gifted kid excel? And what do they need? That compared with differentiated instruction, paired with a teacher, not just thinking about the teacher doing it alone.
You
So-
have 1 minute.
What's that?
You have 1
Oh,
minute.
thank you. So I just wanted to say, thrilled that there's one more for next year. And I know that there's a lot of attention and a lot of resources, not enough resources for all the needs. But as you're thinking about any other adjustments to the budget before July 1, please know that the loss of GIS this year made a huge impact on my daughter. She actually regressed between fall and winter. She went down instead of gaining. Now, there's 100 variables for why that is, but I firmly believe that loss of having Mr. Armpriester with her, on a weekly basis in the classroom was a huge piece of that. So I know you've got a lot of tough decisions with the budget, but please consider growing the gifted department to not only where it was, but even beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That takes us to the consent agenda items, and I don't see any treasurer's items this evening, so I would like to entertain a motion for items A1 through 3E, please. Thank you, Mr. Darrow.
Trying to get on the spot.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dominy?
Well, I will just introduce Mr. Sawyers with a kudo to Mr. Sawyers and Dr. Sawyer and our principals. This is a busy, busy time of year getting ready for next school year, and what extraordinary results so early in the year. And so that's why we're bringing action items to you at a work session, which is not typical, but 2 new principals that we will all be proud to welcome in the Albany community.
Thank you, Dr. Dominique. So with that, we're going to start with items number 1A and 1B. We'll introduce to you this evening, and they're in the audience, Mrs. Catherine Katie Nowak. Katie, would you like to stand so everyone knows who you are? This is Katie Nowak. She's currently principal in Southwestern City Schools at Hayes Intermediate School. She has 12 years experience in education, most recently for the last 3 years, again, principal in Southwestern. She's been described as actively collaborating and leading daily to increase student achievement, fostering stimulating learning environments, and motivating and inspiring students and staff to perform to their full potential. To that end, a parent in the school district actually nominated Mrs. Nowak to receive state recognition, and she won. And she is Ohio's 2016 National Distinguished Principal for Middle Level Education through the Ohio Association of Elementary School Administrators. And we stole her from Southwestern. And she's coming to New Albany. We're very excited to have Katie join us. And in our equal excitement, and Mr. Emery's just beaming ultimately, because this is his new team, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Nowak, and Mrs. Unger. Mrs. Michelle Unger is also here this evening. She is the new K-1 elementary principal with big shoes to fill following Mr. Scott Emery as he transitions to his new director's position for elementary ed. For the last 15 years, Michelle's been the director of regional and early childhood education programs, providing direct oversight for 4 school districts in Perry and Hocking County, as well as providing direct support services to 14 other school districts through the Muskingum Valley Educational Service Center. Michelle has extensive background in early childhood education, preschool, early learning, literacy, special education, data analysis, and she's going to be a tremendous asset to the K-1 building and the entire K-5 team with Mr. Emery. So we're very excited that Mrs. Unger also has accepted the opportunity for you to board approve her this evening to become the K-1 principal. Welcome, Michelle. Additionally, in your agenda under letter D, we do have a couple teachers that are actually present this evening that are part of the new hires for 2016-17. The first is Matthew Advaska. He's right over here. He's going to be a 4th grade teacher within the school district. Welcome, Matthew. And the other is Jamie Zwick. She's also going to be a 4th grade teacher within the school district, and she's present here this evening as well. And equally, they went through a laborious process to earn those teaching positions in our school district, and we're very excited to welcome you to the New Albany family as well. I believe the other agenda items, as Dr. Domini said, are standard. It's unusual that we have such a large agenda at a work session, but it's also summer, so you should anticipate that this is going to happen for your June meeting. You'll see a lengthy agenda probably at your June or your regular June board meeting. I know we do not have a work session in July, so your July board meeting will also be lengthy. It's just the way the summer hiring process works. Just as a reminder, under Ohio Revised Code, teachers within the school district can request the release of contract up to July 10th. Thereafter, it's with superintendent permission. That contributes to the summer turnover. In addition to families that change, we've had some spouses that have been moved out of state. We have some husbands or wives that have been transferred. That's happened in the last 2 weeks. It's just part of what happens in the summer. So we lose some wonderful people to then go find extremely wonderful people to replace them. And that's what you see in the agenda tonight.
Any questions? So could we please have a roll call vote?
Ms. Kalinowski?
Yes.
Mr. Darrow?
Yes.
Mr. Newmoff?
Yes.
President Kohler?
Yes, that motion carries, and welcome. So we're really very happy to have you here. I had the opportunity to sit in on several of the interviews, and all I can say is I am exceedingly happy that I was not in the applicant's chair. Much easier to read the questions than to answer the questions. So that brings us to the end of this evening's work. I did want to check, we have a couple of board members who have let me know that they are not going to be able to attend our next board meeting, which is on June 27th. Mr. Newmoff, do you see any conflict with that date?
I could find one, only relative to vacation. If you're looking for an excuse to move it, but I do tend to be here, yes.
Okay, all right. Well, then we will have to poll Mr. McClellan to make sure that he is going to be here. If he cannot be here, we will have to move the meeting.
And you won't have a quorum.
We won't have a quorum, right. So the part of the reason why I hope we don't have to do that is because the June 27th meeting will be Dr. Domini's last school board meeting. And I first of all want to compliment Dr. Domini and Mr. Sawyers. This has been the smoothest transition. It has far exceeded the board's expectations. It's been seamless, absolutely seamless, and it's due to the incredibly high level of professionalism of both of the principals involved. So I appreciate that, but I also wanted to announce to staff and to the community that the board is going to be hosting a reception for Dr. Domini that will take place immediately prior to the June 27th board meeting. We're going to have some festivities that will take place between 5:30 and 6:30 on the evening of June 27th. So I'd like to really encourage everyone who has worked with Dr. Domini or whose life has been touched by her presence to come and share in the celebration with us that evening. So, and I'd like to ask Patrick if you would make certain to put an invitation to the community on our website as well.
If we have to reschedule the board meeting, will that event be rescheduled along with it?
That's a very good question, and one that I don't think I can answer. So right now, let's plan on the 27th for that, and if it turns out that we do need to reschedule the board meeting, then we will just have to reschedule the reception. I guess I did. I could.
See, you have the answer.
takes a little time sometimes. Okay, well, unless there are any other announcements or anything for the good of the order, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
And thank you very much. Could we have a roll call on the adjournment, please?
Mrs. Kalinowski,
Yes.
Mr. Darrow,
Yes.
Mr. Newmoff,
Yes.
President Kohler.
Yes, we stand adjourned. Thanks so much.